The Dollmaker's Curse. I moved to this quiet suburban neighborhood last summer. I was hoping for peace, a fresh start. Writing had become impossible after my sister Emily died. She was just 16, and it broke me. You see, Emily had this old, creepy doll she was obsessed with. I always felt like that doll had something to do with her death. It was only a feeling, but it wouldn't leave me alone. So, here I am, trying to escape the memories, surrounded by cookie-cutter houses and perfectly manicured lawns. The neighborhood was nice enough. Everyone seemed friendly at first. The kind of place where nothing bad ever happens. One sunny afternoon, I was unpacking boxes when I noticed something strange. Across the street, kids were flocking to this newly opened antique shop called the Dollmaker's Haven. The owner, Mr. Beaumont, was an odd guy. He had this unsettling way of staring like he knew something you didn't. At the summer fair, I ran into him. He was showing off some of his dolls, and they were incredibly lifelike. "Beautiful, aren't they?" Mr. Beaumont said, his voice smooth but cold. "Dolls can capture the very essence of a person." "Yeah, they're something," I replied, feeling a chill despite the warm day. He just smiled and looked at me like he knew a secret about me. It gave me the creeps, but I shrugged it off. It was just a doll shop, right? How could it be connected to anything sinister? That night, I found a note slipped under my door. It was in handwriting that looked exactly like Emily's. It simply said, "Stay away from the Dollmaker's Haven." My heart skipped a beat. It had to be some sick joke. There was no way it could be from Emily, but the resemblance was uncanny. I tried to push it out of my mind, but the feeling that something was terribly wrong was creeping back in ill. After finding that note, I couldn't shake the unease. The next day, I decided to explore the neighborhood a bit more, hoping to get my mind off things. As I walked, I noticed how quiet it was. Too quiet. Usually, kids would be playing outside, but now they were nowhere to be seen. I passed by the Dollmaker's Haven again. The window display had changed overnight. Now, there were more dolls, each one more lifelike than the last. They looked so real. It was eerie. One doll in particular caught my eye. It looked just like a boy I'd seen playing outside a few days ago. A shiver ran down my spine, but I told myself it was just a coincidence. Still, the doll's eyes seemed to follow me as I walked by. I quickened my pace, eager to get away from that unsettling gaze. When I got home, I found my neighbor, Mrs. Johnson, waiting by my door. She was an elderly lady, always wearing a floral dress and a kind smile. But today, she seemed off. "Morning, Mrs. Johnson," I greeted her. "Good morning, Daniel," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. I just wanted to say be careful. Sometimes things aren't what they seem around here." I frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" She shook her head, her eyes darting towards the Dollmaker's Haven. "Just be careful, dear. And if you hear any strange noises at night, don't investigate. It's best to stay inside." With that cryptic warning, she hurried back to her house, leaving me standing there, puzzled and more than a little unnerved. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the leaves outside made me jump. Around midnight, I heard a soft, rhythmic tapping sound. It coming from outside my window. My heart pounded as I crept over and peeked through the blinds. There was nothing there, just the empty street, bathed in the dim light of the street lamp. But the tapping continued, steady and persistent. I closed the blinds quickly, telling myself it was just a tree branch or maybe an animal. "Get a grip, Daniel," I whispered to myself. "It's purely your imagination." But deep down, I knew something was very wrong. The days after Mrs. Johnson's warning were tense. The neighborhood's cheerful facade seemed to crack, revealing something dark and secretive underneath. I tried to focus on my writing, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the Dollmaker's haven and the strange events. One evening, I decided to visit my friend Mark, the only person I felt comfortable talking to. He was a local historian and had been living in the area for years. If anyone could shed some light on the strange happenings, it would be him. "Hey, Mark," I greeted as he opened the door. His house was cluttered with old books and artifacts, a testament to his love for history. "Got a minute?" "Sure. Come in," he replied, his voice warm but carrying a hint of concern. We sat in his cluttered living room, the smell of old paper and dust filling the air. "Something's been bothering me," I began, hesitating. "It's about the Dollmaker's haven. Have you noticed anything odd?" Mark's expression darkened. "You too, huh? I've been hearing whispers around the neighborhood. People say the Dollmaker, Mr. Beaumont, isn't just a craftsman. They say he's into dark arts." "Dark arts? Like magic?" I scoffed, but a chill ran down my spine. "Voodoo," Mark said quietly. "There's a legend about a Dollmaker who could trap souls. But that's just a story, right?" I couldn't ignore the fear in his eyes. "I don't know, Mark. I found a note that looked like my sister's handwriting. And Mrs. Johnson warned me about strange noises. I feel like I'm going crazy." Mark sighed, leaning back. "This place has a history, Daniel. Strange disappearances, odd occurrences. But it's always been dismissed as urban legend. If there's any truth to it, we need to be careful." As I left Mark's house, my mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and fears. I couldn't help but think about Emily and her obsession with that old dollar. Was there a connection? My heart ached with guilt and confusion. That night, the tapping noise returned, louder this time. I felt a presence outside my window, a heaviness that made it difficult to breathe. I wanted to run, to get out of that house, but something held me back. In the morning, I decided to confront Mr. Beaumont. I had to know what was going on, even if it meant facing my fears. When I walked into the Dollmaker's haven, the bell above the door jingled softly. The shop was filled with dolls, each one more lifelike than the last. Mr. Beaumont was behind the counter, his cold eyes locking onto mine. "What can I do for you, Daniel?" he asked, his voice smooth as silk. "I want to know the truth," I said, my voice trembling. "What's going on with these dolls? And why do they look so real?" Mr. Beaumont smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "The truth is often stranger than fiction, my dear boy. But sometimes it's best left alone." I felt a surge of anger and fear. "What are you doing to these children? What did you do to my sister?" His smile widened. "All in good time, Daniel. All in good time." I left the shop, more confused and scared than ever. My thoughts were a jumble of fear and determination. I knew I had to uncover the truth, no matter what it cost me. After my confrontation with Mr. Beaumont, I knew I couldn't stop. Something terrible was happening, and I had to find out what. The fear and tension were eating away at me, making it challenging to think straight. But I couldn't ignore the signs anymore. That night, I couldn't sleep. The tapping noise was back, but now it was accompanied by a faint, eerie whispering. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. I decided to follow the sounds, hoping they would lead me to some answers. As I crept through the darkened house, the whispers grew louder, guiding me towards the backyard. I stepped outside, the cool night air sending shivers down my spine. The whispers seemed to be coming from the old oak tree at the edge of the yard. I hesitated, fear gripping me, but I had to know. I approached the tree, and to my horror, I saw something glinting in the moonlight. It was a small antique doll, partially buried in the dirt. I picked it up, my hands trembling. The doll's face was a twisted version of Emily's, and it felt like a punch to the gut. "Daniel," a soft voice called. I spun around, heart racing. It was Mrs. Johnson, standing at the edge of my yard, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. "You have to stop," she pleaded. He'll come for you if you dig too deep. What do you know about this? I demanded, holding up the doll. Mr. Beaumont, he uses the dolls to trap souls. Your sister, she's one of them, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. But you can still save her. You just have to break the curse. The weight of her words crashed down on me. Emily was trapped, and it was up to me to free her. I felt a mix of determination and fear as I made my way back to the Dollmaker's haven, clutching the doll tightly. When I arrived, the shop was dark, but I could see a faint light coming from the back room. I crept inside, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The air was thick with a strange, oppressive energy. I could hear Mr. Beaumont chanting softly, his voice rhythmic and eerie. I pushed open the door to the back room, and the sight froze me in place. Mr. Beaumont was standing over a table, covered in strange symbols and candles, holding a doll that looked exactly like the boy I had seen in the shop window. "Ah, Daniel," he said without turning around. "I knew you'd come." "Let her go," I demanded, my voice shaking. "Let my sister go." Mr. Beaumont turned to face me, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "You don't understand, do you? These souls are mine. They give me power, life. Your sister's spirit is a part of my collection now." I felt a surge of rage and fear. "No, she's not. I'll free her, no matter what it takes." He laughed, a cold, cruel sound. "You can try, but you won't succeed. No one ever does." In a moment of desperation, I lunged at him, knocking the doll from his hands. It fell to the floor, and a horrible wailing sound filled the room. Mr. Beaumont snarled and grabbed me, his grip like iron. "You fool," he hissed. "Do you know what you've done?" But I didn't care. I grabbed a candle from the table and threw it at the symbols. The flames caught instantly, spreading quickly across the room. Beaumont's grip loosened as he tried to save his precious dolls. I saw my chance and ran, clutching the doll I had found in the yard. The shop was engulfed in flames as I stumbled outside, the heat and smoke choking me. I collapsed on the sidewalk, coughing and gasping for air. The flames consumed the Dollmaker's haven, casting eerie shadows across the quiet street. I watched as the fire roared, my body trembling and my mind reeling from the night's offensive. The doll I had clutched so tightly now lay beside me, its face twisted in a grotesque parody of Emily's. The firefighters arrived quickly, but it was too late. The shop was reduced to ashes, and with it, I hoped, the curse that had held my sister captive. But as I sat there, watching the embers die, a heavy sense of dread settled over me. Had I truly freed Emily? Or had I simply unleashed something worse? In the following days, the neighborhood was abuzz with gossip and speculation. Mrs. Johnson avoided me, her earlier warnings now seeming like the ramblings of a frightened old woman. But I knew the truth. I had seen the darkness in Mr. Beaumont's eyes, felt the malevolence in his grip. "Are you okay?" Mark asked, visiting me at home. His concern was genuine, but I could see the fear in his eyes too. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice hollow. "I thought I could save her, but I keep seeing her face, Mark. In my dreams, in the shadows, it's like she's still here watching me." "You did what you could," he said gently, "but you need to take care of yourself now. Maybe talk to someone about it?" I nodded, but deep down, I knew no therapist could help me. The nightmares were relentless, each one more vivid than the last. I saw Emily, trapped inside that twisted doll, her eyes pleading for release. I heard her voice, whispering my name, begging for help. One night, unable to sleep, I found myself drawn back to the charred remains of the shop. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and something else, something darker. As I sifted through the ashes, I found it, the doll I had seen in my yard, miraculously unscathed by the fire. My heart pounded as I picked it up, a sense of foreboding washing over me. Suddenly, the doll's eyes opened, and I heard Emily's voice, clear and desperate, and, "Daniel, help me." I stumbled back, dropping the doll. The realization hit me like a freight train. I hadn't destroyed the curse, I had only transferred it. Emily's soul was still trapped, and now it was bound to this doll, tied to me forever. At that moment, the full weight of my actions crashed down on me. I'd been so focused on destroying Mr. Beaumont and his twisted creations that I hadn't considered the consequences. The curse was never about the dolls. It was about the souls they contained, and now Emily's soul was forever bound to mine. The next morning, I packed my bags. I couldn't stay in that house, in that neighborhood, knowing what I had done. As I drove away, the doll sat in the passenger seat, its eyes following me. I knew I was unable to escape it, no matter how far I ran. Years have passed, and I've moved countless times trying to outrun the curse. But no matter where I go, the doll is always with me, a constant reminder of my failure. I can still hear Emily's voice in my dreams, begging for help, and I know I'll never find peace. I thought I was saving her, but I only condemned us both. The Dollmaker's curse lives on. It has found a new vessel, and it was me. Revenge from Beyond. Ever wonder what it's like to be haunted by something you can't see? I never did, until I moved to that little town in upstate New York. My name is Michael, and this is how it all started. It was supposed to be a fresh start. After the divorce, I needed a change. My job as a journalist had become more than just work. It was an escape. So when I got the assignment to write about the old Marlowe mansion, it seemed like the perfect distraction. The town was small, quiet, and surrounded by dense woods. Just the kind of place where you could disappear, if only for a little while. I rented a cozy little cottage not far from the mansion. It was the kind of place you'd expect to see in a postcard. White picket fence, flower beds in the front, and a big, inviting porch. But even on the first night, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. It was around midnight when I heard a knock on the door. Strange, considering I didn't know anyone in town. When I opened it, there stood an old woman with wild gray hair and piercing blue eyes. "Stay away from the mansion," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "There's unfinished business there. Vengeance from beyond." I tried to play it cool. "I'm just here to write a story," I said, forcing a smile. She shook her head, looking past me as if seeing something I couldn't. "You've been warned," she muttered before turning and disappearing into the night. I closed the door, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. Who was she? And what did she mean by vengeance? I brushed it off as local superstition. Every small town has its ghost stories, right? But there was something about her eyes, something that made me uneasy. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows seemed to move in the corners of the room, and I kept hearing faint whispers, like the rustling of leaves. I told myself it was just my imagination. After all, the mind can play tricks on you when you're alone in a new place. I tried to focus on my work. The Marlowe mansion had a dark history. A woman named Eleanor was brutally murdered there by her lover, Arthur, 50 years ago. The townsfolk said her spirit never left, seeking revenge on anyone who dared disturb her. The next morning, I went into town to gather more information. At the local diner, I asked the waitress about the mansion. "You really shouldn't be poking around there," she said, refilling my coffee. "Bad things happen to those who do." "Like what?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She leaned in, lowering her voice. "People disappear, strange noises at night. Some say they've seen her ghost." I laughed nervously. "Come on, ghosts. Really?" She gave me a serious look. "Just be careful, all right?" I nodded, but I couldn't help feeling a mix of curiosity and dread. Maybe there was more to this story than just folklore. I spent the day doing research at the local library, digging through old newspapers and records about the Marlowe mansion. The librarian, Mrs. Hawthorne, was a stern woman with sharp features and a no-nonsense attitude. When I asked her about Eleanor and Arthur, she gave me a tight-lipped smile. "You're better off leaving those old stories alone," she said, sliding a dusty book across the desk. "Nothing good ever came from stirring up the past." As I walked back to my cottage, the sky darkened with storm clouds. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and I noticed the trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches creaking like old bones. The path, usually so clear, seemed to twist and turn in ways I hadn't noticed before. That evening, the power went out. I lit a few candles and settled in to read the book Mrs. Hawthorne had given me. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and insistent. As I flipped through the pages, I came across a photograph of Eleanor. She had a haunting beauty. Her eyes filled with a sadness that seemed to reach out from the photo. The caption read, "Eleanor Marlowe, 1923 to 1953. A life cut tragically short." Suddenly, I heard a creak from upstairs. My heart jumped into my throat. "It's just the house settling," I told myself, trying to sound braver than I felt. But then I heard it again. A slow, deliberate creak, like footsteps. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly made my way up the narrow staircase. Each step felt like it echoed through the whole house. At the top, I shone the light around, revealing nothing but dust and shadows. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next day, I met Agnes again. She was standing at the edge of my property, watching me with those piercing blue eyes. "You're still here," she said, her voice almost disappointed. "Yeah, I'm not scared of ghost stories," I replied, forcing a grin. She shook her head slowly. "It's not the stories you should fear. It's the truth behind them." I tried to laugh it off, but her words stuck with me. That night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. They seemed to come from all directions, filling the room with a low, mournful hum. I pulled the covers over my head, but the noise seeped through, relentless. The next morning, I found strange symbols drawn in the dust on my window. They looked like they had been etched with a sharp object. Goosebumps prickled my skin as I traced the lines with my finger. They formed a pattern, one that seemed eerily familiar from the book. I decided to confront the fear head-on. I visited the mansion in broad daylight, hoping to dispel the sense of dread. The house loomed over me, its windows like dark, empty eyes. The front door was slightly ajar, swaying gently in the wind. As I stepped inside, the air turned cold, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The mansion was a decaying shell of its former self, with peeling wallpaper and broken furniture scattered everywhere. But there was something else, an unsettling stillness, as if the house was holding its breath. I found myself drawn to a particular room upstairs. As I entered, the temperature dropped even further, and the air grew thick with the scent of damp and decay. In the center of the room was a large, ornate mirror, its surface covered in dust. I wiped it clean with my sleeve and froze. Reflected in the mirror was not just me, but the faint outline of a woman standing behind me. Her eyes were sad and filled with a silent plea. I spun around, but the room was empty. My heart pounded as I stumbled out of the mansion, my mind racing with questions. What had I seen? Was it my imagination or something more? The shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching out like fingers trying to grasp me. I couldn't deny it anymore. Something was terribly wrong, and I was in the middle of it. The mystery of the Marlowe mansion was no longer just a story I was writing. It was a nightmare I was living. Back in town, I couldn't shake the image of that woman in the mirror. I started asking more questions, hoping someone would give me answers. The locals became more distant, their friendly smiles replaced with wary glances. It felt like they knew something I didn't, something they were too afraid to share. One afternoon, I bumped into a man named Tom at the diner. He was an old-timer, the kind of guy who'd seen it all. I decided to take a chance. "Hey, Tom," I said, sliding into the booth opposite him. "Can I buy you a coffee? I've got some questions about the Marlowe mansion." Tom's eyes narrowed. "That old place? Best to leave it alone, son. Bad history there." "I've heard the stories," I replied, leaning in. "But I need to know the truth. What really happened to Eleanor and Arthur?" Tom sighed, his weathered face creasing with age and worry. "Eleanor wasn't just a victim. She was into dark things. Voodoo, curses, you name it. When Arthur killed her, he unleashed something. Folks say her spirit's still looking for justice." "Justice?" I echoed, my stomach knotting. "Or revenge? Depends on how you look at it," Tom said, sipping his coffee. "But trust me, nothing good comes from stirring up the past." I left the diner feeling more confused and unsettled. My thoughts were a tangled mess of fear and curiosity. That night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. They seemed to come from within the walls, filling the room with their eerie chorus. I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying Tom's words. The next day, I decided to call my ex-wife, Sarah. We hadn't spoken much since the divorce, but I needed to hear a familiar voice. "Hey, Sarah," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I know it's been a while, but I'm working on this story, and it's getting to me." Sarah sighed on the other end of the line. "Michael, you've always had a way of getting in over your head. What's going on?" I hesitated, not wanting to sound crazy. "It's this old mansion. People say it's haunted, and I think they might be right. I've seen things, heard things." "Michael, you know how your imagination can run wild," she said gently. "Maybe you should come back to the city, take a break." "I can't," I replied, feeling a lump in my throat. "I need to see this through, but thanks for listening." "Just be careful, okay? Don't let this consume you," she said before hanging up. Her words stayed with me. Was I letting this consume me? Was my fear and curiosity blinding me to the danger? That night, the whispers turned into cries, echoing through the house. I could feel the walls closing in, the shadows growing thicker. I needed answers. The next morning, I went back to Agnes. She was in her garden tending to a bed of wilting flowers. "Agnes," I called out, my voice trembling. "I need to know the truth about Eleanor. Why is she haunting the mansion?" Agnes looked up, her eyes filled with sorrow. "Eleanor's spirit is restless because she never got justice. She cursed Arthur with her dying breath, and now her spirit can't move on. Is there any way to stop it?" I asked desperately. "To put her to rest." Agnes shook her head. "The curse is strong. To break it, you need to find what she left behind, the source of her power. But be warned, Michael. You're dealing with forces beyond our understanding." As I walked back to my cottage, her words echoed in my mind. I felt a growing sense of dread, knowing that my search for the truth was leading me deeper into darkness. My internal struggle was a constant battle between fear and determination. I had to know the truth, but at what cost? The nights grew longer, the shadows darker. The whispers turned into screams, filling my dreams with terror. I was losing sleep, my sanity fraying at the edges. I was no longer just an observer. I was a participant in this haunting, and there was no turning back. After my talk with Agnes, I knew I had to find whatever Eleanor had left behind. The fear gnawed at me, but so did my determination. The whispers in the cottage had turned into screams, haunting my every moment. My sleep was broken, filled with nightmares of Eleanor's face twisted in anguish. One stormy night, I decided to return to the Marlowe mansion. The wind howled, and rain lashed against the windows as I packed a flashlight, a notebook, and a few other essentials. The mansion loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the lightning-streaked sky. Inside, the air was damp and cold. My footsteps echoed in the empty halls as I made my way to the room with the mirror. The sense of being watched was overwhelming, like eyes pressing in from all sides. I tried to focus, remembering Agnes's words about finding the source of Eleanor's power. Suddenly, I heard a familiar voice. "Michael, you shouldn't be here," it whispered, almost pleading. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the darkness. "Eleanor?" I called out, my voice shaking. "What do you want?" The temperature dropped even further, my breath visible in the freezing air. Shadows swirled, forming a vague outline of a woman. "Justice," the voice replied, more insistent now. "Justice for what? For Arthur?" I demanded, stepping closer. The figure solidified, and I could see Eleanor's face, her eyes burning with an otherworldly fire. "He took everything from me. My life, my future. He must pay." "I'm not Arthur," I pleaded, backing away. "I'm just trying to understand." She moved closer, her presence suffocating. "You disturbed my rest. Now you must help me find peace." "Tell me how," I whispered, feeling the weight of her sorrow pressing down on me. She pointed to the floor beneath the mirror. "There lies the key." I dropped to my knees and began prying up the floorboards with trembling hands. The old wood creaked and groaned as I uncovered a small, ornate box covered in dust. I opened it, revealing a collection of voodoo artifacts. A small doll, pins, and a lock of hair. My stomach churned at the sight. "This is it?" I asked, looking up at her. "This is what's keeping you here?" Eleanor nodded, her expression softening for a moment. "Destroy it and I can be free." I hesitated, my mind racing. Could it really be that simple? But before I could decide, the door to the room slammed shut with a deafening bang. The air grew thick, and I felt a presence I hadn't noticed before. Arthur's spirit, malevolent and vengeful. "You won't break the curse," a voice growled, echoing through the room. "She's mine." Eleanor's figure wavered, her fear palpable. "Michael, please," she begged, her voice breaking. I grabbed the doll and the pins, my heart pounding. "You don't own her," I shouted, plunging the pins into the doll with all my strength. The room shook violently, and a deafening roar filled the air. Arthur's presence grew stronger, a dark shadow looming over me. "You will pay for this," he hissed, his form twisting in rage. "Not today," I muttered, throwing the doll into the fireplace. The flames roared to life, consuming the artifacts in a blaze of light. Eleanor's scream mingled with Arthur's roar, and then there was silence. The shadows receded, and the room grew still. Eleanor's figure began to fade, a look of peace finally settling on her face. "Thank you," she whispered before disappearing completely. I collapsed to the floor, exhausted and shaken. The mansion was quiet, the oppressive weight lifted. I knew Eleanor was free, but the cost had been high. As I left the mansion, the first light of dawn breaking through the storm clouds, I felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. The nightmare was over, but the scars would remain. I had confronted the darkness and survived, but I knew I would never be the same again. The truth had been revealed, but it came with a heavy price. The Marlowe mansion stood silent behind me, its secrets finally laid to rest. The days after the confrontation at the mansion were a blur. I tried to return to my normal life, but everything had changed. The screams and whispers were gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that weighed on me like a lead blanket. My dreams were no longer filled with nightmares of Eleanor, but they were still restless, haunted by shadows that seemed to flicker just out of sight. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. My editor called, wanting to know how the story was coming along. "Almost done," I lied, my voice hollow. "Just need to wrap up a few details." "You've been through a lot, Michael," she said gently. "Take your time. We can wait." But I couldn't wait. I needed to finish this, to put it behind me. I pored over my notes, trying to make sense of everything. The more I wrote, the more it felt like the darkness was seeping into me, tainting my thoughts and turning my words into something I didn't recognize. One evening, Sarah called. It was rare to hear from her, especially after our last conversation. "Michael, I've been thinking about you," she said, her voice filled with concern. "You don't sound like yourself." "I'm fine," I insisted, though we both knew it was a lie. "Listen," she said, her tone softening. "Maybe you should come back to the city just for a while. Get away from that place." I wanted to argue, to tell her that I had to finish what I started. But the truth was, I was scared. Scared that I'd never be free of what happened. Scared that I was losing myself to the darkness. "Maybe you're right," I said finally. "I'll think about it." That night, as I was packing up my notes, I found the small, ornate box from the mansion. I had taken it with me, hoping to study it further, but now it felt like a weight I couldn't bear. I decided to burn it, to rid myself of its cursed presence once and for all. As the flames consumed the box, I felt a strange sense of relief. Maybe now, I thought, I could finally move on. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The next morning, I woke to find a note slipped under my door. It was from Agnes. "Come to the mansion. There's something you need to see." My heart pounded as I made my way back to the Marlowe mansion. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the decaying structure. Inside, the air was thick with dust and memories. Agnes was waiting for me in the same room where I had found the box. "There's more to this story, Michael," she said, her voice filled with a quiet intensity. "Eleanor's spirit may be at rest, but the darkness that consumed Arthur is still here." "What do you mean?" I asked, a chill running down my spine. Agnes pointed to the mirror. "Look." I turned, and for a moment saw nothing but my own reflection. But then the image shifted, and I saw Arthur's twisted face staring back at me, his eyes filled with rage and hatred. "No," I whispered, stepping back. "It's not possible." Agnes shook her head. "The curse wasn't just Eleanor's. Arthur's darkness lives on, and it's latched onto you." Panic surged through me. "How do I stop it?" "You can't," she said softly. "Not without paying the ultimate price." As her words sank in, I felt the darkness closing in around me. I realized then that I was doomed, just like Arthur. The mansion had claimed me, and there was no escape. Desperate, I tried to leave, but the shadows seemed to reach out, pulling me back. I stumbled into the hallway, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The walls twisted and warped, and I could hear Arthur's laughter echoing through the halls. I reached the front door, but it wouldn't budge. The darkness was all around me, suffocating and relentless. I sank to the floor, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. I was trapped, just like Eleanor and Arthur. In a final act of defiance, I pulled out my notebook and began to write, hoping that somehow my story would be a warning to others. As the last of the light faded, I could feel the darkness seeping into my soul, claiming me as its own. My last thought was of Sarah and the life I had left behind. I hoped she would understand, and that someday, someone would find my words and know the truth. The Marlowe mansion had taken another victim, and the cycle of vengeance and darkness would continue, and my story would end here, in the shadows. But maybe it would help someone else avoid the same fate. And as I wrote the final words, I knew the twisted truth. Some curses can never be broken, and some stories are destined to end in darkness. The Unearthed Doll. My name is Mike Henderson, and this is the story of how a simple yard work task unearthed something that should have stayed buried. It was a chilly autumn afternoon, leaves crunching underfoot as I raked the backyard. My place is in a quiet suburb. Nothing special, but it's home. Well, it was home before everything went sideways. I was recently divorced, trying to piece my life back together. My ex-wife, Karen, and my teenage daughter, Emily, were gone. The house felt empty, just like me. I was raking leaves when I hit something hard. At first, I thought it was just a rock, but when I dug around it, I found an old, weathered box. Curious, I pried it open and found a creepy voodoo doll inside. It was wrapped in old cloth, bound with twine, and gave off a weird vibe. Mike, you should have left it alone, I muttered to myself, already feeling a chill run down my spine. Later that day, I ran into my neighbor, Mrs. Crenshaw. She's an odd old lady, always muttering about spirits and bad omens. She saw the doll, and her face turned pale. "You shouldn't have disturbed that," she said, eyes wide. "Some things are meant to stay buried." I shrugged it off, but her words stuck with me. Little did I know my troubles were just beginning. A few days after finding the doll, I was in the kitchen making coffee when I felt a sudden chill. The temperature dropped so quickly I could see my breath. The thermostat read 72, but it felt like an icebox. My first instinct was to blame the old house. It had its quirks after all. But then, I heard it. Whispers. Just faint enough to make me question my sanity. "Nah, Mike. You're just tired," I muttered, shaking my head. But the hairs on my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling. Later that evening, as I tried to sleep, I heard faint footsteps in the hallway. At first, I thought it was just the house settling. However, the steps were rhythmic, almost purposeful. I got up, heart pounding, and checked. Nothing. The hallway was empty. I told myself it was simply my mind playing tricks. The next day, I noticed objects in my house weren't where I left them. My keys, which I always placed on the kitchen counter, ended up in the bathroom. Books from the shelf were on the floor, open to random pages. Each time I convinced myself it was just forgetfulness or the drafty house. But deep down, I knew something was off. Emily called that night. Our conversations had been strained, but this one was particularly tense. "Dad, are you okay? You sound different," she said, concern lacing her voice. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a bit tired," I lied, trying to mask the unease creeping into my voice. "Are you sure? You know you can talk to me," Emily pressed, her voice softening. "I know, Emily, I'll be fine. Just need some rest," I reassured her, though I wasn't convinced myself. As days passed, the strange occurrences escalated. Doors creaked open on their own, and shadows seemed to move just out of sight. One evening, while I was in the basement sorting through old boxes, the lights flickered and went out completely. I fumbled in the dark, my breath quickening, until the lights suddenly came back on. I glanced around, feeling the weight of unseen eyes on me. The basement felt like a different place altogether, heavy with an oppressive silence. My instincts screamed at me to get out, but curiosity kept me rooted. "Might be time to get a professional in here, Mike," I muttered to myself, my voice echoing eerily in the confined space. The unsettling details kept piling up, each one gnawing at my sanity. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening was tied to that damn doll. And the more I ignored it, the worse it seemed to get. The more the strange occurrences piled up, the more isolated I felt. It wasn't just the eerie happenings around the house. It was the growing distance between me and everyone I cared about. One evening, after another night of restless sleep and whispered voices, Emily called again. Her concern had turned into frustration. "Dad, you sound worse every time we talk. Are you sure you're okay? Maybe you should see someone." "I'm fine, Em," I snapped, more harshly than I intended. "Just dealing with some house issues." "House issues? What kind of issues, Dad?" "You never tell me anything," she retorted, her voice rising. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "It's just small things. Weird noises, stuff moving around. Probably just the old house settling. Don't worry about it." You're always doing that, pushing me away. I'm not a kid anymore. I can handle it, she said, her tone softening, but the hurt was clear. Look, I'm sorry. It's been rough here and I don't want to drag you into it, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I'll figure it out. After we hung up, the guilt weighed heavy on me. Emily was right. I was pushing her away, just like I had pushed everyone away since the accident. The nightmares about my brother, the constant guilt, it was all too much. And now this house, this doll, it felt like everything was closing in on me. That night, I decided to call Karen. It was late, but I needed to hear a familiar voice, even if it was my ex-wife's. Karen, it's Mike. Sorry to call so late. Mike, what's wrong? She asked, her voice tinged with concern. Despite everything, she still cared in her own way. I think something's wrong with the house. I've been hearing things, seeing things, I confessed, feeling a lump in my throat. There was a pause. Mike, have you been taking your medication? You sound paranoid. I'm not crazy, Karen. I know how it sounds, but something's not right here, I insisted, frustration bubbling up. Maybe you need to get out of that house for a while. Take a break, clear your head, she suggested, her tone soothing but distant. I can't just leave. It's my home, I said. Though I knew she had a point. Think about it. For Emily's sake, if not for yours, she said before we ended the call. Her words stuck with me. Maybe I did need a break. But where could I go? This was my home, and despite everything, I felt tied to it. The thought of leaving felt like giving up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that if I left, whatever was happening would just follow me. As the days passed, my interactions with people grew more strained. My coworkers noticed my distracted state, and my boss called me into his office. Mike, your performance has been slipping. Is everything okay at home? Yeah, just dealing with some personal stuff, I lied, forcing a smile. Take some time off if you need it. Get your head straight, he suggested, clearly worried. Thanks, I'll think about it, I replied, knowing that time off wouldn't solve the real problem. The house felt more oppressive each day. The whispers grew louder, the shadows more menacing. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched, judged, and the doll, now locked away in a drawer, seemed to call out to me, a constant reminder of the nightmare my life had become. I started questioning my sanity. Was it all in my head? The trauma, the guilt, the stress. It all felt like it was manifesting into something real, something dangerous. But every time I thought about leaving, something pulled me back. A sense of unfinished business, of a mystery that needed solving. I couldn't leave, not yet. Not until I knew what was really going on. One night, the whispers became screams. The shadows seemed to twist and dance, mocking me. I knew I was unable to ignore it any longer. Whatever was happening in my house, it was escalating, and I had to face it head on. I decided to go back to the basement. The cellar door creaked open, and a cold draft hit me, sending shivers down my spine. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of determination, I descended the creaky wooden stairs, each step echoing in the oppressive silence. The basement was dimly lit, filled with old boxes and forgotten memories. As I moved deeper, the air grew heavier, almost suffocating. I reached the spot where I had found the doll and noticed a small hidden door partially concealed by a shelf. With trembling hands, I pushed it open. Inside was a small room filled with sinister artifacts. Old, yellowed papers covered in strange symbols, jars with unidentifiable contents, and in the center, a makeshift altar with the charred remnants of the doll. The sight made my stomach churn. I felt a presence behind me. Whirling around, I came face to face with the twisted vision of my brother, Jake. He looked just as he had in my nightmares, twisted, malevolent, and blaming. "You did this to me," the apparition whispered, his voice echoing with pain and anger. "No, Jake, It wasn't my fault, I stammered, stepping back. It was an accident. Accident? You left me, he accused, his form shifting, becoming more grotesque. The lights flickered and went out. I was plunged into darkness, only the dim glow of my flashlight guiding me. The walls seemed to close in. The whispers grew louder, merging into a cacophony of tormented voices. I didn't leave you, I cried out, tears streaming down my face. I couldn't save you. The vision of Jake lunged at me, and I felt a searing pain in my chest. I fell to the ground, clutching my chest, gasping for breath. The room spun, and I struggled to distinguish reality from nightmare. In the midst of my pain, I heard a soft, almost serene voice. "Let go, Mike. You have to let go." It was Emily, or at least her voice in my head. It grounded me, brought me back from the brink. Gathering my strength, I stood up. The vision of Jake was still there, but I faced it head on. "You were my brother, Jake. I loved you, and I still do. But you're gone. I can't change the past. I can only live with it." With that, I grabbed the charred remains of the doll and set it on fire again. The room filled with an intense heat, and the vision of Jake screamed, dissolving into the air. The fire consumed the altar, the symbols, everything. As the flames died down, the basement was silent, eerily calm. I collapsed to the floor, exhausted, but the weight on my chest had lifted. The oppressive atmosphere was gone, replaced by a strange sense of peace. I made my way back upstairs, my body aching and mind racing. I called Emily. It's over. I think it's really over this time." "Thank God, Dad," she replied, her voice filled with relief. "Come visit me, please." "I will, sweetheart. I promise," I said, meaning every word. I spent the rest of the night in the living room, the house finally silent, and likewise I could still feel the lingering presence of the past, but it no longer held the same terror. The house had secrets, dark ones, but they were out in the open now, and I was ready to move forward. In the quiet of the night, I felt a sense of closure. The horror had reached its peak, and I had survived. I knew the road ahead would be tough, filled with healing and rebuilding. But for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. And as I drifted off to sleep, I knew that whatever came next, I would face it head on, unafraid. The next few days were a blur of phone calls and visits. Emily came to stay with me for a week, her presence a balm to my frayed nerves. We talked more than we had in years, sharing stories and finally addressing the elephant in the room. Jake's death. "Dad, I've always felt like you blamed yourself," Emily said one evening as we sat on the porch, the setting sun casting long shadows on the ground. "I did," I admitted, the weight of the confession lifting a burden I hadn't realized I was still carrying. "But it wasn't my fault. I know that now. We both have to move on." Emily nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "I missed you, Dad. I don't want to lose you again." "You won't, Emily, I promise," I said, squeezing her hand. As Emily and I started to rebuild our relationship, I found myself reflecting on the events that had transpired. The house felt different, lighter, almost. The oppressive atmosphere was gone, but the memories lingered. I decided to look deeper into the history of the house and the dolly. I visited the local library and dug through old records, finding that the land my house was built on had once belonged to a man named Elias Thorne, a practitioner of dark magic in the early 1900s. He had been rumored to use voodoo dolls to control and manipulate others. The doll I found was one of his creations, buried to hide his secrets. The more I learned, the more I understood the power of guilt and unresolved trauma. My own guilt over Jake's death had given the doll power, manifesting my fears and insecurities. But now, with the doll destroyed and my past confronted, I felt a sense of closure. Weeks turned into months, and life started to return to normal. Emily visited more often, and our bond grew stronger. I even started seeing a therapist, something I had avoided for years. Talking about my experiences helped me process the trauma and move forward. One day, as I was clearing out the basement, I found an old photograph tucked behind a beam. It was of Elias Thorne, standing in front of what looked like my house, holding a doll identical to the one I had burned. A shiver ran down my spine, but I dismissed it as a relic of the past, something that no longer held power over me. Emily and I decided to take a vacation, a chance to get away from the house and create new memories. As we packed, I felt a sense of excitement and hope. The horrors of the past were behind us, and a new chapter awaited. But on the night before we were set to leave, I had a dream. In it, I was back in the basement, the air thick with the smell of burning cloth. I saw Jake, standing next to the altar, his eyes filled with sorrow. "You can't leave," he whispered, his voice echoing in the darkness. I woke up in a cold sweat, the room filled with an oppressive silence. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just a dream. But as I went downstairs to get a glass of water, I saw it. A small, charred doll sitting on the kitchen counter, identical to the one I had burned. My heart raced, and I felt a cold dread settle over me. I picked up the doll, my hands trembling. How was this possible? I had destroyed it, ended its power, or so I thought. As I stared at the doll, a horrifying realization dawned on me. The house, the doll, even Jake's apparition, it was all connected, all part of Elias Thorne's curse. And it wasn't just the doll that held the power. It was the land. The house itself. Emily found me in the kitchen, the doll in my hands. "Dad, what's going on?" she asked, her voice filled with fear. "We have to leave, Emily, now," I said, my voice shaking. "We can't stay here. The curse isn't broken." We packed rushing, leaving the house behind, the doll still burning in my mind. As we drove away, I glanced back at the house, its windows dark and empty. I had escaped, but the terror lingered, a constant reminder that some horrors can never truly be left behind. And as we drove into the night, I knew that the battle wasn't over. The past had a way of creeping back. No matter how deep you buried it, the curse was still out there, waiting, biding its time.